And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Franklin Escobedo. I'm the Community Services Director for the Larkspur Library and Larkspur Recreation. We're here this morning for not for pruning, that's in 2 weeks, but to talk with Bob Mauceli about gardening with native plants. So we'll begin shortly as more people come into the room, and I think we're a few minutes before 11. We have time for people to come in. If you got the email this morning, I just sent out about 15 minutes ago 2 of the handouts that we'll be having for today, but I'll also put them in the chat box in a few minutes so people can access them again. Today, when you ask questions, just please use the Q&A or the chat box to ask the questions and I'll relay them to Bob. And thank you again for joining us this morning. And curbside has resumed at the library, so we're open Tuesdays through Saturday from 12 to 4. So if you put books on hold, you can pick them up. Just remember to call, and please remember to wear your mask when you come and pick up your stuff, because you never know who you're going to bump into at curbside. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have a talk for pruning for beginners with Margaret Shue and UC Master Gardener Betty Jennings. So we'll send a follow-up email this afternoon with a link to the recording as well as a link to the survey for the Master Gardeners. So just keep an eye out for that. So if for some reason you get bumped off today, we are recording today's event and it will be on our YouTube channel. And then, so we just give it another minute here before we get started. And again, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Franklin Escobedo. I'm the Community Services Director for the Larkspur Library and Larkspur Recreation. This is part of our ongoing series of garden talks that we've been doing since COVID happened. And we're really happy that the UC Master Gardeners have partnered with us to do this. This is brought to us by the Commons Foundation, the UC Marin Master Gardeners, and our Zoom was made possible by the Friends of the Larkspur Library. Let me stop this. So I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have Bob Mauceli back. He's a UC Master Gardener. He's been a gardener for a while. This is, I think, our 3rd talk with Bob. He does a great job, and he's going to share with us again how to garden with native plants. So I'm going to hand this over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Well, I seem to have done something wrong again, so let me just take 1 second and go back and try and get it the way it should be. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see both the your slide and the next slide.
Okay, great. You're not supposed to see the next slide. So I'm going to hide that because that's just going to confuse everybody, including me. Okay, so I'm going to talk this morning about gardening with native plants. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, why I think everybody should go native in their gardens, at least in part of their gardens. I'm going to talk about the native plant communities here in Marin County. That's important because if you understand what grows there naturally, and that's in a plant community that you live in, then you'll understand what you need to provide in your gardens for these plants to be successful. I'll talk a little bit about native plants for the gardens and about how you might make a native garden. But before I get to that, let me give you a word from our sponsor, at least here in the Marin Master Gardeners. Marin Master Gardeners are trained volunteers. Our main mission is to provide research-based information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices. We go through about an 80-hour training program, but most of us have been gardeners for more than most of our adult lives. So my wife and I moved to Marin County about 7 years ago, which of course makes me a Johnny-come-lately here, since most of the people that we've met have lived in Marin County since God made little green apples. Given that, why should you believe anything that I say about native plants and native plant gardening in Marin County? Well, when you're faced with something like this, which was my backyard when we moved in here in 2013, and what we had were about 10 beautiful, mature valley oaks and about 21 young Tuscan olive trees. And the rest of it was this barren wasteland that you see before you. And when I went up on it, you know, I'm a good master gardener, right? So the first thing I'm going to do before I put in a garden is I'm going to do a soil test. Well, when I went up on this hill with a railroad pick in my hands, I was able to get down only about 6 inches in the hard-packed, brick-packed clay that this hill is made out of. And so at that point in time, I knew that I needed to do something to get me ready to do anything here. But what I had decided was that it was probably best for me to think about putting in a garden that used plants that grew here before any developments were built in this area. And so I did a lot of research. I did a lot of crash studying, and I worked with a landscape architecture to come up with this. And this is what it looks like today. And we'll talk about a little bit about how it got there. And I will be happy to share with you at the end of this presentation some more looks at the garden and what it brings to us. Because I'd like to bring home some of the claims that I'm going to make during this presentation. I'd like to bring home those claims in the reality of what you can do when you start with a barren hillside and end up with something that looks like that. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about native plants. You're looking at the California state wildlife wildflower, the California poppy, which is the archetypal native plant here in the state of California. So California has an amazing diversity of plants. The California Native Plant Society and others have done studies of discovering native species. And what they've come up with is somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 taxa of native species and their cultivars. And actually, I believe the latest research has shown it that it's probably closer to 8,000 than 6,000. In the Bay Area, there are about 3,000 of these. And in Marin County, the CNPS chapter here in Marin County has found about 1,600 of these native species. But the question is, you know, what exactly is a native? Is it only endemic plants, plants that grow in California and nowhere else? Or is it plants that grow in California and nearby areas like Southern Oregon and Northern Mexico? Or is it plants that grow west of the Rockies? And does it include only the species, or does it include the cultivars and subspecies of those species? Well, what we've decided to do in this presentation is to focus on plants for landscape usage. And that probably reduces the number of 8,000 plants to about, I'd say, a third to a half that. And mainly the reason is, as we'll see, is that the rest of these plants grow in areas or plant communities that are not compatible with Marin County's plant communities. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But we want to look at plants that are suitable for landscape use, that are compatible with our plant communities, that are survivable in them, that are sustainable in them, and that we can actually buy. The plant that you're looking at here is a Ceanothus. You should tell that by the beautiful flowers that it has. And it is Ceanothus Ray Hartman. When this picture was taken, it was about 6 to 7 feet tall. It'll eventually get to be about 12 to 15 foot tall and about that in diameter. So why native plants? Besides the fact that you've got a brick-like hot hill to fill with a garden. Well, the main reason that I believe we should be using native plants is to help restore what has been lost. And let's talk a little bit about that. The situation in California in general, and even in Marin County, is that the native diversity of plants and animals is disappearing. That's partly due to loss of habitat by development or by using it for other uses like agriculture. But it's also due to fragmentation, the breaking up of the natural landscape that has been here for centuries into smaller fragments that are separated from one to another. When we think about what the development is, that home and business landscapings up to the recent past have been about 80% exotics, including about 92% of the acreage in homes in lawn, neither of which are native to this area. And what that has led us to is to serious species loss. I'm looking at a picture here of a California towhee. That California towhee, it's a male, is my neighbor. It lives with me on this yard that we have here. And it's got in its beak the caterpillar of a white-lined sphinx moth. And it's looking tired because it's having trouble finding enough food to feed the young nestlings that he's carrying that caterpillar too. He and his mate need to find 350 of those kinds of insects every day to feed what they probably got in their nest of 5 nestlings. And they've got to do that for 2 to 3 weeks until the nestlings fledge and can go look on their own for food. And what we've seen is that there's serious species loss, not only in native plants, but also in the insects like this caterpillar, and in birds, and even in some of the mammals in this area. For example, over the past 20 years, here in Marin County, where we normally see about 500 species of birds, studies have shown that populations of about half of those have been reduced by 30 to 50% or more. And part of that is due to the fact that there aren't enough insects to feed the nestlings to replace the population that's lost. Insects have fallen tremendously. Some butterfly species have reduced their population by more than half. And even mammals, we see fewer and fewer of the native mammals here in Marin County. And I'm sure that people who are having deer problems would take issue with that. They probably see more than they want to. But even the deer population has significantly reduced in the county. So it's a really serious problem. And one of the key things that we can do to solve that problem is to replace the exotic plants and lawns that we have in our homes with native plants. And the reason for this is that native plants are what grew here, what do best here, and that are used more heavily by the insects and birds and mammals that we share here. And the reason for that is that the native plants have co-evolved with what's here, with our Mediterranean climate, with the topography of the area, with the soil of the area, with the plants of the area, and the animals, birds, and insects of the area. When we have this co-evolution working, we have California's true landscape. And what that helps us do is restore the biodiversity that we may be losing. We can rebuild the habitats. We can support wildlife, particularly beneficial wildlife, and we can create a healthier environment for them and for us. Why plant natives? Well, sustainability is one example. And here's an example from a study that was done in Santa Monica, California, where native plants in gardens used 83% less water, produced 56% less green waste, and required 68% less maintenance. Now, these numbers may not be the same for gardens in Marin County, but they're probably pretty close. And certainly they do say that native plant gardens will use less water, produce less green waste, and require less maintenance. The other reason to do it is that there are a number of ecological qualities that native plants have or provide that are important. First of all, they are locally synced with everything that's going on around us. They grow well here. They did before, and they can again. They produce and use things that produce fewer harmful pathogens. And probably most important, they provide us with essential natural services that we and everything around us need. Things like the sequestration of carbon, things like the reduction of water runoff and prevention of flooding, and other things like that. So using native plants are really important and provide a significant benefit to us. Now, I talked a little bit about Marin plant communities. So let's take a look at what they are. First of all, a plant community is something that is a repeatable assemblage of plants that grow together because of similar adaptation to the climate and microclimate in which they are, to the soil and slopes in which they are, and to the biotic factors that surround them. And here in Marin, the primary plant communities we have in the fog belts are redwood forests and mixed conifer forests, coastal scrub. In the more open, drier, and sunnier places, oak and foothill woodlands, grassland, and chaparral. And the key to all of this is understanding where natives grow increases your chance of success. I would not plant in my garden things like the rose bay and California azalea that grow quite well in the southern and western parts, more forested parts of Marin County. They wouldn't last one summer here. But I can grow beautiful Ceanothus and California buckwheat that would have difficulty growing in the areas that are foggy and have cooler and less sunny things. So it's really important to try to understand where you live and what plant community you're in. Let's take a look at some of these. So I'll start with the redwood and mixed evergreen fog belt forests. And that's a picture of one of them. What I'm going to do here is talk about a little bit about what's going on and a little bit about the plants that might grow there. So in these areas, they have cool, moist springs and even summers, and they share the Mediterranean winter, but with much that we all share, but with usually much higher rainfall than, for example, we get up here in Novato. And the kinds of things that grow here are coast redwood, of course, Douglas fir and coast live oak in the trees, the western azalea, California rosebay, evergreen huckleberry, none of which I could grow on my hill here in North Novato. Some of the beautiful plants that grow in these moist woodlands and areas are trillium, red columbine, western meadow rue, a western sword fern, spiny wood fern, and redwood sorrel, and a lot of others of these kinds of plants. The next thing we'll look at is when we go a little bit higher and a little bit closer to the ocean or the bay, we run into a plant community called the northern coastal scrub. This is kind of like some people classify as a, quote, soft and, quote, chaparral. And the kinds of, again, this is a windy, windswept area, number one. That's why it's a scrub. Things don't grow as tall here as they might elsewhere. And it also is subject to either oceanic or bay influences in terms of fog, moisture, and even salt. So some of the plants that grow here are California sagebrush, coyote bush, some species of Ceanothus, mainly the low-growing species of Ceanothus, black sage, cow parsnip, and ajuga or hedge nettle. These are kinds of some of the plants that grow in these areas. Lower, softer kinds of plants. And then we have oak and foothill woodlands. And in case you're interested in the difference between a woodland and a forest has a closed canopy. A woodland like this has an open canopy. This is a pretty classic example of an oak woodland. It's what I see when I walk out my front door in the morning to go pick up the morning paper. Here we have a sunnier, hotter, and drier microclimate. And so that's what causes the open canopy. It's akin to another one we'll talk about in a moment, the grasslands. We get about 20 to 25 inches of rain per year, as opposed to 30 or more inches of rain in southern and western parts of Marin County. And of course, we start with the trees. That's why it's called a woodland and an oak woodland. Valley oaks, blue oaks, coast live oak, California black oak, and the host for sudden oak death that grows along with all of these, the California bay tree. But we also have shrubs and wildflowers that are common to this area. Coyote bush, but this would be taller and twiggier than you would find in the coastal scrub. Coffeeberry, common manzanita, and other tall shrubby manzanitas. Suncup, blue dix, California brome, and California buckwheat for grasses, perennials, and small shrubs grow throughout this entire area, along with a lot of other beautiful shrubs and wildflowers. Grasslands is the next one. Here we find very, very few trees. One of the reasons that is this particular plant community is the most challenged of all of the plant communities in Marin County. And the reason for that is that it's been produced or turned into pasture for cattle and other agricultural uses. And therefore, the exotic grasses and forbs or other plants that grow here but are not native have driven out most, if not all, of the native plants. And it's something that we really should do something about. The kinds of things that should be growing here in terms of the native plants are June grass, Idaho or blue fescue, red fescue, which is native to California, and other grasses that are native to California. And the difference between these grasses and the grasses that have been introduced to feed cattle is that these are perennial grasses, whereas those are annual grasses. And the annual grasses grow and drive out these perennial grasses before the perennial grasses can grow. Wildflowers are predominant here. California poppy, farewell to spring, blue-eyed grass, and other wildflowers in native grasslands grow sometimes very profusely. And then finally, the chaparral. Here, we're growing even higher and even hotter. Most of these are south or west facing hills. And the plants it's much drier. And the plants and the reason why it's much drier is it's much steeper, and a steep slope has higher runoff than flatlands do. And so the kinds of things that grow here are twiggier, Some are fire enabled and are taller, usually reaching for the sun. So we have coffeeberry, we have bigberry manzanita and other tall manzanita shrubs as opposed to low-growing manzanitas. The Ceanothus here, again, is also shrubby and mostly taller than you would find in other areas where it grows. Chamise, mountain mahogany, and scrub oak also grow here and in profusion, pardon me. So that's where they grow. Now let's talk about how you move them into your garden. And the first place where you start is by planning what's going to happen. So this is the plan for my garden that was developed for me by a landscape architect that I was working with. And for her, I developed the list of plants that I thought would grow here after looking at doing research on what grows in the oak woodland plant community around me. I back up to open space here. And so I was able to even find out what's still growing there. And designing the garden, you know, basically assessing the site, what's there and what's not, thinking about what plants you can choose that will be successful here, laying it out in terms of masses, in terms of how big these plants will be at maturity, in terms of the hydrozones in which they need to be, and in terms of the fire ladders that the massing might produce. Thinking about turf issues. And most important, particularly in an area like mine, is thinking about and planning the irrigation infrastructure that'll support this garden. So these are the kinds of things that you look at. You look at the plant community, the climate and the microclimate, the exposure, the soil pH and quality, which in this case was not great. The contours, very steep hills here. Some of the hills in the back of my house are over 100% grade, which means about a 45% degree angle. The contours that you're dealing with and the existing plantings. I didn't have to worry a lot about that. So plant choices in terms of plants that do well. And that's the examples that I'm going to be showing you here. One of the handouts that you have is a 2-page list of plants, about half to 60% of which I actually grow here. And so you'll be able to pick these up. But in terms of manzanitas, the manzanitas that do well are in gardens in general, are the Howard McMinn manzanita, Sunset manzanita, Sentinel manzanita, low-growing manzanitas in the Pumila and Edmondsii species, and low-growing cultivars such as the ones that are in the Arctocephalus hookerii species. Ceanothus. Ceanothus is one of my favorites. In fact, my wife tells me that I've never met a Ceanothus I didn't fall in love with and buy. I grow all of these, and I can attest to the fact that they grow well in gardens. So Concha Ceanothus, Blue Jean Ceanothus, Ray Hartman, you already saw a picture of, Anchor Bay, which is a great, relatively deer-proof or deer-resistant ground cover. Yankee Point Ceanothus, which is a beautiful Ceanothus when it's in bloom, and Joyce Coulter Ceanothus, which is a large ground cover. So if you've got, a lot of area that you want to cover, this is one to consider. It grows about 2 to 3 feet tall and up to 15 feet in diameter. And it looks like that when it's in bloom. Other choices that grow well in our gardens here in Marin County. Coffeeberry, particularly the Eve Case and Mount St. Bruno cultivars. Pink flowered currant. Those beautiful flowers turn into beautiful racemes of berries, which you can actually use to make jelly. That is, you can actually use them to make jelly if you get to them before the robins do, because they will strip that and have stripped that particular variety in a day. Toyam, which is Christmas berry. That's another one that if you want to use it for your Christmas decoration, you better move out quickly, because the ones that we grow here, we've never been able to do that since both the robins and the cedar waxwings come in and eat all the berries before we get to them. Western redbud, hollyleaf cherry, and garrya are other decorative horticultural cultivars and species that grow well in our gardens. In terms of perennials and subshrubs, California fuchsia, red-flowered buckwheat and other buckwheats, yarrow, Cleveland sage, cultivars, and cultivars of other species of sage do well here. Island alum root and the scarlet monkey flower are also examples of things that grow there. Again, for more examples than this, I refer you to the list that's in the handout that Franklin has sent out and will put into their database. So one of the things that we're trying to get people to think about is lawn replacement. Number one, lawns use a lot of water. It's believed that a 1,000 square foot lawn here in Marin County requires somewhere between, depending on where you are, between 50 and 80,000 gallons of water per year to grow. And that's a lot of water. And so we'd like you to replace that. Replace it with native grasses like California native bent, California fescue, or creeping red fescue, or Idaho fescue, and native bunch grasses like Nacella, aristata, and others. Or with low-growing perennials like the sages, like Salvia spathaceae, which is hummingbird sage. And you'll see some examples of these later on in the presentation. Wiregrass or other ground covers like carex or Ceanothus or Manzanita. But if you're going to remove the lawn, you've got to develop a lawn removal and weeding strategy first, because you're going to have to pull the weeds that will come up for the first year or two, and you really should be able to tell the difference between a weed that's coming up and a good plant that has set seed and is growing and thriving in your new replaced lawn. So planting. Well, when you plant natives, it may be counterintuitive, but choose smaller plants. In my garden, when we planted it, we planted mostly gallons. We planted 4-inch pots and very few 5-inch and larger. And the reason for that is simple, is that the smaller plants in our native soils establish faster. They grow their root masses faster. And so one of the things to think about is buying these smaller plants. They're also easier to plant. You have to dig a smaller hole, and you have to take care of them in different ways, and they use less water to become established. We think that you should plant naturally, and in similar hydrozones. So in plants that require less water, group those together. That's a hydrozone. In plants that require a bit more water, group those together. That's another hydrozone. And the reason for doing that is, number one, if you plant really drought tolerant plants where in amongst, say, roses, where they'll get more water, if you want the roses to grow, that can actually damage those plants. But it certainly uses water that is not needed. And most important, think about maturity and the spacing of your plants. There was a book written by a woman whose name I cannot remember, and the title of the book was, "But it was so small when I bought it." You look at places where people have large conifers in their front yard, practically overshadowing the house. That was once a small live Christmas tree, probably. And it grew and got bigger and bigger and bigger. So think about what your plants will look like when they grow up. In essence, what we're talking about is putting the right plant in the right place. When you plant natives, you use the native soil. You don't till, you don't cultivate, because that actually damages the structure of the soil. And you don't fertilize or provide amendments in the hole that you're planting the thing is. You plant it slightly higher than it's grown in the nursery. The reason for that is you don't want the crown to get below grade where it will die, can die, if it gets overly moist or smothered and kill the plant. I know this from a fact because the first group of plants that we planted 7 years ago in our garden here were planted by a crew that didn't know that. And we lost about half of them because they died after the first rains. You want to dig a hole, it's twice the diameter of the container you're dealing with. That's the reason why I say choose gallon plants. That's a hell of a less wide hole than a 5-gallon. You want to make sure that the crown is at least 1 to 2 inches above grade. If you've got a gopher problem, for all but really what's called gopher resistant native plants, you probably want to put gopher wire down or a gopher wire pot around them. And you can then mulch with compost or other mulch, but keep it at least 3 or more inches away from the stem of the plant to reduce plant damage due to the water and moisture that mulch going up right against the stem will cause. As I said before, establish your hydrozones in your plan and then plant that way. Similar water requirements are important. You need to irrigate new native plants. Although they will be drought tolerant, they need to establish. They need to set their roots down into the soil. And so you need to irrigate for at least 1 to 2 years in most cases. And you need to irrigate infrequently but deeply so that you're forcing the water to go down into the soil and encouraging the roots to grow deeper and broader. And when you are irrigating, you put the emitter close to the crown at the start, right after you plant it, because that's where the main roots are. But then as the plant grows taller and spreads, you want to begin to move the emitter or emitters out to the drip line of the plant. That's where the feeder roots are, and it's the feeder roots that take the moisture up. One of the main things we see as master gardeners is that people don't move those out, and they're wasting their water, or at least a lot of their water. Keep the crown clear and above grade. And there are some issues with plants. One of them is the availability, although I must say that that has become much improved over the 7 years that I've been buying these plants. There are many more nurseries that either specialize in native plants or at least carry reasonable menus of them than there were when we started out. Summer color is lacking. Our plants mainly go, or a lot of them, go dormant in the summer. It's, quote, their winter, end quote. So try companion plants, plants from other areas that are in Mediterranean climates, like South Africa or Southeast Australia or Southeastern Chile, or even the Mediterranean complex in Europe. Many of those plants may be in bloom and when ours are not. And do expect some plant loss. What I and others have found is probably about 20% of the plants that you originally plant may be lost. And you're lucky if that doesn't happen. Another problem with these is people ask, the most prevalent question I get and others in the Master Gardeners get about native plants is, but aren't they a fire hazard risk? And our answer is, it's how we do our landscapes, how we set them up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's much more important than plant choice in reducing fire hazard risk. And in fact, we've got a whole program on that. I and others are out talking about how you would go about that in some detail in those presentations. So this is the way setting up defensible space looks. Close to the home, 0 to 5 feet. That's called the immediate or ember resistant zone. 5 to 30 feet from the home is called the intermediate zone. And 30 or more feet is called the extended zone. And all of those refer to the distance from the home that embers will fall, because it's embers that cause most homes to burn in a wildfire situation. So what you want to do is create that defensible space. And because embers are the cause of most homes burning, we want you to really concentrate on taking care of the area that's 0 to 5 feet from your home, removing plants that touch the house, removing plants or pruning them down if they're too tall under windows or under eaves, and in some cases, removing the plants entirely where you can't get that kind of spacing. In your landscape, what you can do is reduce fire risk by placement and spacing, less dense planting, good vertical and horizontal separation between plants, trees limbed up and shrubs pruned so they are both above the fire areas and also don't provide as readily fuel, and creating fire breaks between groups of plants. And most important, designing the garden for maintenance, plant care, and appropriate irrigation. Maintenance is important, not just to reduce fire risk, but also to produce healthy native plant gardens. Practice good basic care and cultural practices. Clean up underneath the plants and the plants themselves. Prune out dead wood, thin it where it needs it, and deadhead after flowering goes away. Deadheading is important because of two reasons. Number one, it gets rid of possible fuel, but it also, if you deadhead at the right time, may cause a second bloom or lengthen the blooming period. Hydration, of course, is key. And when you do have to deal with plant pests or diseases, use IPM or integrated plant pesticide management procedures. And all of these things are covered on our website, and the website URL is in the handout that you will get as part of this. So when do we do all this? Well, normally we planted and prepared our site in the spring, summer, and fall. And in the fall and early winter, that's when we're planting. Get them in the ground and pray for rain. I've done some planting. Unfortunately, my prayers for rain, as are all our prayers for rain, have not quite been answered to the extent that we would like. But whatever we get will help those plants get established. So remember that with natives, it's mostly all about spring, but not all about spring. Let's take a look at some of that. This is important because if you build it like this part of my garden, which is in early spring, and you've got Ceanothus, the blue flowers, and poppies in bloom. Here we're looking up the hill. Because the hill is steep, I use wattles. Those are those long sausage-like things to slow down the runoff. Here we're looking across the hill and into the olive grove, our water feature, and paths throughout that serve two purposes. One, they're a way to get around, but two, they're also a fire break, which is important. And that's a good way to provide paths. They reduce the compaction of the soil around your plants, and they provide some sort of a fire break. Here are more views looking east. You see in the upper area here, that's a Ceanothus blue jeans in full bloom. Here we have Chaparral, well, I've blown it, a senior moment there, but beautiful vines of white flowers. Here are the hummingbird sage in bloom, backed up by El Dorado Ceanothus, a large shrub. And the hummingbirds really love hummingbird sage. If you can only plant it in a small area of your garden, I would recommend it, because if you love hummingbirds, you'll get them in with that if you get them in nowhere else. So all of these pictures are pictures of my garden. It's what we were able to turn the hill in. And believe me, if I can do it, anybody can do it. And these white flowers I just remembered are the Chaparral clematis. They're the native clematis in California. This is a perennial border that is really a pollinator garden, and it's what I call a habitat corridor garden. It's small, only about 15 by 18 feet, but if everybody had one of these in their garden, that would go a long, long way to help reducing the hazards that beneficial insects face without these kinds of things. You're looking down here, all of these plants underneath the oaks are various species of ribes or California currants, which grow well in the partial shade under oaks. And here are some of the plants that I grow. This is up at the top, Ceanothus concha, the yellow-orange plant is the native Vermontodendron. This particular cultivar is Ken Taylor. Here is the pollinator garden in full bloom. These are low-growing salvia species backed up by other blooming species. This is Salvia clevelandii Pozo Blue. It is a great early to midsummer bloomer. If you deadhead this back, it will rebloom. I can't tell you the number of bees, hummingbirds, and other beneficials, butterflies, use these salvias. We have Pozo Blue here to the left and California buckwheat. California buckwheat is low growing. This particular variety is the a red variety. They can take heat. They're very drought tolerant and they bloom for long periods. On the right are the Ceanothus blue jeans that are in bloom. They are beautiful. They bloom in early to mid-spring, and they are amazing, and they are covered with various beneficial insects, bees, hoverflies, and other insects and pollinators. In the lower left, well, what can you say? There's the California poppies. And to the right of them are Clarkia, a farewell to spring. This blooms in late spring through early summer. It's a native wildflower. We didn't plant these, we found them, and we love them. They are beautiful plants. They self-seed, and so if you take care of them and provide a place for them, they will be beautiful. So if you build all that, they will come. Butterflies. Here we have up at the top, the western swallowtail, below it, the anise swallowtail. But we have about 25 species of butterflies we've seen here in our garden. And then the birds. This Rufous hummingbird, which is a transient here. It's on its way from Southern California and Northern Mexico to as far as Nome, Alaska, which we've seen them nesting in. Here it's at the hummingbird sage, giving the hummingbird sage its name. It was coming through to fuel up on its journey, and it found what it wanted, a native plant. It found it because it recognized it, because it's built into its brain. And what we know about this is that birds use native plants about 3 to 8 times more than they use exotic plants. Other birds, bluebirds on the left, below it is a spotted towhee. To the right of the towhee is Ma and Pa California quail. And then above it is one of our migratory orioles, which nest here in our oaks and our native palm trees, and are striking when they show up. If you want to get one of these in your garden, if you've got some native palm trees or oak trees close to your house, if you see one of these, put out an orange. They'll come to oranges if they're around. And then if you see one come to the orange, you can just go out and buy a large jar of cheap grape jelly and feed them that. They love it. Oh, by the way, and it's good for them too. So here are beneficial insects. At the top line are native California bees. We've got one of our native dragonflies in the lower left, and there's a picture of one of our hoverflies in the right, lower right. What's important about hoverflies? Well, they're pollinators, but they don't eat insects or anything like that. The reason they're a beneficial insect is they lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae, and a single hoverfly larva will consume 30 or more aphids per day. So welcome, hoverfly. And that's about it. If you build it, they will come. And I'd really like you to build it, if you will. Thanks for coming. Questions?
The first one, Bob, was somebody asked if you had recommendations for a native plant that would provide tall privacy screening.
Yeah, probably one of the best, well, there are a couple. One of the best ones, however, depending on where you live, is wax myrtle. Mm-hmm. It's a green, evergreen plant. It has, almost invisible flowers in the spring, which turn into berries, hard little waxy berries in the fall, which the birds really love because they've got a lot of fat in them, and they use those for tanking up into migration. That's one choice. It can grow 20 feet tall, but you can keep it pruned lower than that if that's too tall for you. It's a great plant. It's pretty hardy. It's drought tolerant. And as I said, it's evergreen, so it's really useful. The other thing is that some of the taller Ceanothus, like the Ray Hartman, are good screens. They're evergreen. They have beautiful blue or white flowers in the spring, and they can grow anywhere between 10 and 15 feet tall. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, so the next one's a long one. I'm trying to learn more about putting the correct soil in containers for my native plants. Example, I bought an Indian mallow and a woolly blue cereals. They both call for succulent soil, but buying this commercially is too expensive. So I make sandy loam with potting mix. Not sure though.
What you can do is you can use organic. Well, number one, if you can find soil, commercial soil that's labeled for succulents, that would be good to use. And if you look at that soil, it is it's got the base of it, probably about 50% of it, or maybe more, is some sort of organic potting soil. But then it's got in it some gravel. It's got probably some other pumice in it. Sand, if you're talking about sand, and you're talking about commercial builder sand, or even things like aquarium gravel, that's the right kind of sand to use. Fine sand that you would use in a sandbox or see on a beach is not, because that actually can reduce in some cases, can reduce the runoff of water rather than let it run off. So you can mix your own. If you go to a building or garden supply, bulk garden supply place, and ask them for about, take a 5-gallon bucket with you and ask them for some of their pumice or broken lava rock and stuff like that, more than likely they'll give it to you. But even if they charge you for it, they won't charge you more than $1 or $2. That's how I do it. If I use either succulent potting soil, or I take organic soil, about 50% to inorganic material. Provides for the runoff, and it reduces the nutrients, which a lot of our native plants don't want.
Okay, so someone's asking, how did you deal with the hard clay on your land? If you don't break it up, how can water and or roots penetrate?
Okay, what happens is, what you do is when you dig the hole that you're digging for the plant, twice in its diameter, and just the depth of the soil ball itself. Then you put back the soil that you took out. The first thing you do is you put about half of it back, and you water the plant and the soil until the water actually sits in the hole. And then you let it drain. That may take, if you've got really heavy clay, a couple of hours or maybe an afternoon. Then you put the rest of the soil back, and you set up your normal irrigation and water the plant. What happens is that most of our native plants, particularly the ones that do well in clay or on slopes, like Manzanita, Howard McMinn, basically their roots will force themselves down through the soil until they find natural water. That's called establishing them. And once they do that, then you can cut back on the water. I still water my garden probably twice per month in the summertime. And I water it, even in the areas where the oaks are, I water it long and slow, because most of the plants on my hill, which is a really hot south-facing hill, it can get to 120 degrees on it, really need some water during the hot, dry summer and even into the fall. And so it depends on where you live, but that helps them, again, get established. What you're trying to get them to do is to drive down their roots. And so it's kind of like tough love.
Someone asked if the handout included companion colorful plants from South Africa, but I don't think it does.
I'm sorry?
They asked it, did the handouts include companion colorful plants from South Africa?
No, basically the list that's in the handout is only California natives and their cultivars.
And if you didn't get the email, it's actually, I put the links in the chat box right now, so you can click on those, and those will take you to the PDFs for the handouts. Someone asked, what is a chaparral?
What is the chaparral?
Mhm.
It's the natural area in California and other Western states that grow usually on the either western or southern facing hills, high hills, foothills, and so on. And it's usually made up of some of the plants that I said: Manzanita, Ceanothus, shrubby Manzanita, shrubby Ceanothus, um, uh, uh, things like chamise, and things like that. And but shrubby, usually plants that can take low water situations, and also situations in which the soil drainage is really good. One of the places in which you can see archetypal chaparral is to go up on Mount Vision over in West Marin, and get up to about, oh, I don't know, 2,000 feet, and you will be in chaparral. There are also places here in Marin where you can find it. And so a lot of the hikes that people take up into the foothills here eventually will come up into chaparral. But it's shrubby, high drainage, steep, hot areas on the top of foothills or hills, or even below the area, below the tree line. You know, if you go up on Mount Tam, you will be in some of the areas, you will be in chaparral, particularly some of the areas that are managed by MMWD for their watershed.
Okay. Someone asked, how far down do you prune sages and milkweeds, and what time of year to prune?
I'm sorry, how far down do you prune?
Do you prune sages and milkweeds, and what time of year do you
Okay,
prune?
well, let's take salvia or first. Usually after the salvia blooms, I cut it back by about a third. And that hopefully is going to encourage vegetative growth, but probably in many cases, it will not produce a rebloom on the salvia. And then in the fall, I cut it back, depending on the cultivar, I cut it back to about another third down or even lower. And you do that in the very late fall or even into winter. And what you're looking for is, before you cut it back that far, you're looking down at the base of the salvia to see if there is some new growth coming. And you cut it back to above that to about 2 or 3 live buds. You'll be able to tell that, you know, when you look at that stem, you'll be able to tell that at some point in time, that dormant leaf bud is going to grow, and you cut it to just to that. So you need to, what you need to do is you need to look at a book on pruning, and go to the library. There are several books on pruning to give you, dependent on what cultivar you're dealing with, how to do it. And the other one was salvia and
Milkweeds.
milkweed. Milkweed will die back in the wintertime, with the exception of the exotic milkweed that grows here with the orange flowers, the so-called subtropical milkweed. That should be cut back to the ground 2 to 3 times during its season. And the reason for that is, number one, it harbors parasites that can damage or sicken monarch butterflies. The second thing is, since it blooms later and longer than the regular milkweed, it attracts the monarchs to it to lay eggs at a time when they should be migrating. And so it diverts them from their normal routine, which is healthy for them. And the other native branches of like the narrowleaf milkweed will more than likely die back in the spring. They're perennial, pardon me, in the fall. They're perennial, so they will come back in the late spring. Be patient about that. They really do not come back until late spring or maybe even early summer, but they will come back.
So someone's asking the best plants for shaded root field area under redwoods.
Directly under redwoods, unless they're limbed up, probably nothing will grow. But things that will grow in the same area as redwoods and in the same soil or plant community are the things like western azalea and so on that I pointed out earlier in this. Western azalea, ground covers, if you're lucky, rosebay, although that's hard to get started. What you have to do is you have to put it far enough away from the redwood that it's not competing with the large root mass that redwoods have. And so it's got to be well beyond the drip line of the redwood. Otherwise, it won't, flourish.
Okay. What can I plant around and among roses, which I can't live without?
What you plant around there is plant things that are in the same hydrozone as the roses are. The roses, since you want to keep the roses have to dominate in terms of the amount of water that you provide them. And so you want to plant things that, number one, can take that amount of water or even require it. And there are natives that require moderate water. And you want to make sure that you plant things that don't dominate the roses, don't really outcompete with them. And so, hang on one second, I'm going to get a prop. You can find this book at the Larkspur and other libraries. The title of it is California Native Plants for the Garden, and it's written by Carol Bornstein, David Frost, and Bart O'Brien, three really savvy people. And you can find this at the Larkspur Library, or actually in most libraries in Marin County. Whenever I've given a talk at the county, at a library, I usually go through their stacks, and if they don't have one of these, I suggest they buy one. So go to this. In the back of it, you'll find lists of plants for native plants for specific uses, and look at those lists for your situation, and then read the formatter of the book, which will give you cultural suggestions and places to plant them. So this is a really useful book to get or to reference in the library.
Someone's wondering is there a local, can you recommend a local nursery that specializes in native plants?
I can't recommend only one because we're not allowed to do that. But there are two up in Sonoma County, up near Santa Rosa. One of those is California Flora. The other one is Emerisa, Emerisa, a really good source for smaller size plants, 4-inch plants, actually is Annie's Annuals. They usually have a pretty good selection of native plants. And there are native plant nurseries. There's one down in Mill Valley, and I'm sorry, but my memory has failed me on the name. I think if you were to Google native plant nurseries in Mill Valley or native plant nurseries in Marin, you would find its name. So there's 4 of them. There are 2 or 3 over in Berkeley, and 2 or 3 over in the East Bay, and in the western East Bay. So they're right along the shore. If you go to our website, you will find a list of native nurseries in the immediate Bay Area, North Bay area, that deal, if not solely in native California plants, that they have good selections of them. So go to our website for that. And our website is marinmg.ucanr.edu.
I'll also include it in the email, the follow-up email, everybody. So.
Okay, good.
So the next one is any suggestions for a hedge of native plants growing about 2 to 3 feet wide and 4 to 5 feet high in full sun. It can be either a natural hedge or a regularly pruned, and they're in Southern California.
Well, they're in Southern California.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of actually plants that you can do that will get to that size. Some of the smaller Manzanita will do that. And the Manzanita like Sentinel, which, is about 3 to 6 feet tall by about 4 or so feet in diameter. You can do that with Howard McMinn, which normally grows larger than that. But if you pinch it back, you can keep it into that kind of thing. That's also true of some of the smaller Ceanothus varieties like Skylark, and there are varieties of those that you can keep, pinched or pruned back to that same length. Coffeeberry is another one, particularly the Mound St. Bruno cultivar of it. That's almost exactly what you want. It's 4 to 5 feet tall and about 3 to 4 feet in diameter. So there are a lot of native plants that meet that. Even some of the ribes, but those are deciduous. Those are not evergreen. So if you want something that's green around, the 3 examples that I gave are good ones. Again, you can go if you go to the the California Native Plant Society website and type in Calscape, CALSCAPE. That'll bring you to a website of theirs that if you put in your address or your town, they will present you with a list of plants that grow in your plant community. And you should be able to find things in that from wherever you are.
There's another one. What do you have under olive trees? Native grass?
Basically, we keep our, underneath our olive trees clear, and we mulch it with compost. But then around them, the area of our garden in which it grows is what was here when we got there. And it is mainly exotic grasses and some wildflowers. And we mow twice a year. We mow in April and then again in June to keep the fire danger down.
So someone was asking about the pink flowered shrub in your pollinator garden. What was that called again?
Pink flowered.
I think it was the one with the hummingbird, that last slide you had shown with the hummingbird.
Oh, that's actually it's called hummingbird sage, Salvia spathaxacea, and it grows about, it's a ground cover. It grows the actual plant grows, oh, I'd say about 1 foot to 2 feet. And then the flower space comes up in the spring. And it's another, it may get 2 feet tall. And that's a really good plant to bring in the native hummingbirds.
So we have a few more questions, but we've run out of time. So I'm going to email them to you, Bob, and if you can respond to these questions, and then I'll send them out in the follow-up email.
Okay, that's fine.
So, but everybody, thank you for joining us, and look for the follow-up email. These last few questions, I know there were a few in the chat that we couldn't get to, and one more about moles. I'll have Bob answer them for me, and then we'll send them out in the email. So, but again, thank you, Bob, for joining us this morning. We're happy that you could join us, and we'll see you in a few more weeks when we talk about fire smart landscaping as well. So okay. I'll have all those details in the email that's going to go out in a little while, but thank you everybody for joining us. And again, thank you, Bob, for being here today.
Okay, well, you're quite welcome. Glad to be here.
You guys have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.